Welcome to the NGIN special training session on multilateral engagement. We're going to be doing a workshop today to talk about the UN system, how it discusses youth issues, how it's founded, and to talk about how you can get engaged in this space. My name is Robin Anderson. It's a great pleasure to welcome all of you here. I'm the president of Emerging Ag, and I'm from a farm in Manitoba, Canada. So agriculture and food have been my whole life, and I have the great opportunity to work with brilliant young people from all over the world who are engaged in being at the forefront of the sector. Youth can be great leaders of change, great next generation thinkers, and that's what NGIN is all about. So we're here today to talk a little bit about what the UN is, how multilateralism works. I'm going to give you a little background on that. And this will be the first in 2 workshops. We'll talk more about that second workshop next. But my colleagues and I have the great pleasure to be joining you today. And one of the things we'd like to talk to you a little bit about is how to do introductions in the context of the UN system. You know, we already see a lively chat. I think this is one of the most wonderful things that you're comfortable with this online technology. And I want you to already start thinking about how you can engage at the UN. So we've already seen Amanda, who was the very first to introduce herself. I think it's great to use that moment in the chat to do a little bit of storytelling. So we've seen Justin note where he is from. So who are you? What do you do? Are you a farmer? Are you a young scientist? Are you a biologist? Are you an agronomist? And then what is your impact on the issue being discussed? Could you say something about what you hope to get out of this event? Or let's imagine this is a UN event and you have a chance to introduce yourself and you say something about, I'm really interested in how to get more young women involved in food and agriculture. How about the opportunities for more case studies or a concrete example of a program you're involved in? I work on a program at my school to teach more agricultural education. We run a community garden at our school. We're a part of a young entrepreneur project working on digital agriculture. Any of these kinds of things add texture. So while you're in the chat, think about picking 2 or 3 of these things, where you're from and what your interest is. Think of it as a moment to get people contemplating what's really important, like school-based agricultural education, or something related to land tenure, or your interest in climate change. So please go ahead and add some more content in that chat and think about how to make the most of that opportunity. Akira, we love that you already talked about digital agriculture projects and where you're from. Great to see the biggest student association represented here, Thomas. That's a fantastic example of how to add some weight to your observations to help empower the other people from IAS on the call. People who are interested in animal husbandry, in biotechnology, as community developer and social entrepreneurs working on hydroponic farms. It's so exciting to see you here. And if you are coming in as event guest from that generic reminder, please do pop into the rename function and rename yourself so that we can know who you are here and in the chat. So I think all of you are getting a great idea about how to share a little bit about how you are. I love that Patricky is a food technologist. I think you're the only one we've seen in the chat so far. It's such a great way to know more about who is on the line, but also signal who people should be calling upon when you're in these UN events. So before we turn to the content of the UN, I'd like to call on a very great leader in the youth space Xander Bex from NGIN, from NGIN. Xander runs the secretariat. Xander, over to you. We'd love to hear from you a little bit about what the priorities are at NGIN and why we're doing this.
Well, thank you so much, Robin, and thank you for this great introduction. Yeah, first of all, thank you for partnering with us in this great first event. This for us is like a new child being born. NGIN is running since November, but this is our first opportunity we do with young people. And what is more exciting, that on the top global level, being engaged with UN is being facilitated with your experience and these great minds here present. And my name is Sander Brex. I'm an agriculture engineer, talking to you from the Netherlands, from a dairy farm which my family-in-law runs. And I've been engaged in getting youth to the table, getting youth in the driver's seat for climate-related challenges. That's what I've natured us, which includes great examples of agri foods since 2009, actually. And great to have worked before with Robin and being engaged in the UN dynamics. But here, sitting in front of you on behalf of the Secretariat, on behalf of the Board of NGIN. And before I talk a little bit more, there was already a question about this, which I would like to answer. I would like to give the floor virtually to our chair, Nele, who wants to talk to you from a nice video. So I'll take the screen if that's possible.
Morning, good afternoon, good evening, dear NextGen agricultural leaders around the globe. My name is Nele Herman-Valenci, and I am speaking to you as the chair of the NGIN board. We are so happy to see all your interest in our first ever NGIN opportunity. Today's training is the first of its kind, an online advocacy training designed to enable youth voices to actually be represented in important policy processes. So you will find out about the UN system, about food and agriculture related topics, who's important, what you can do to raise your voice, to have a seat at the table, and to impact policies that will actually have an impact on all of our lives later on. You are the future leaders, so your voice should be part of the policy recommendations framed today. So please raise your voice, keep at it. Please let us know what you need, what you hope to gain from a platform such as NGIN, the NextGen Ag Impact Network. So get in touch with us through the website on info@nginag.org, or contact me, contact other coalition partners directly through LinkedIn or other contact ways. So have a great session. I'm looking forward to hearing from you, and let's get started.
Well, that's inspiring words to kick it off. Like I said, with the first activity together with American Ag in NGIN history, which is quite short. Just allow me a few minutes to explain NGIN and also in the relation with what we do now and why we hosted this. Because there's a great opportunity. We would have done this workshop if we've started last year. But there's a great opportunity because there is a tension at the UN dynamic in Rome, which Robin will elaborate on later, but on getting youth involved in youth in policy, youth streams. So that's there's a European Year of Youth. There's so much attention for youth, but we as NGIN, we want to engage in a youth-led dynamic, getting youth at the table at this policy dynamics. But also try to see what is needed. We have started with 17 partners who are all aligned with the same principles. We want to create room for the new generation in agriculture and food. And you sitting in this workshop are that new generation. And we want to create room to put you at the table, to see what you need, to get to the tables in Rome at the UN, but also what is eventually the big impact is what is needed in the regions all across the globe to create food security, which is unfortunately still one of the biggest challenges at stake at this moment. So NGIN is aligned with 70 partners. We are still getting more partners. We want to be youth-led, and we want to take your ideas back to reality. So what is needed is what we're going to take on. And this is also where this workshop has been based on why we do that. So we're not going to invent wheels that are already there. There's already a lot of networks, but from the scope, from education, leadership, up to work and policy engagement, we want to design activities, co-create on what is needed, because you as the new leaders want to take that on. So there will be a follow-up workshop based on this UN dynamics we're going to introduce you in. There's this great implementation actually of this dynamics in Rome in the end of October, where the Committee on World Food Security will take place in physical form, hopefully, where is invitations and possibilities to be really engaged in these UN dynamics, which Robin might be turning some lights on, but we definitely as NGIN will, with Robin and with other partners, try to engage you in to really put practice into what we preach here. Next to the fact that we have a great flagship project going on, coming together in June, and what the most important thing there is that we're looking for NGIN ambassadors. There was already a question if there's going to be some information about this. Please take a look at the websites or leave your email address there so we can inform you about this if you're interested. But the most important core of NGIN ambassadors is that we want to be youth-led. So we need ambassadors in the forefront of UN policy dynamics, or creating new jobs or opportunities for young people, or creating sustainable food productions in regions. So please let us know that. And we can send you the wishes we have for NGIN ambassadors, what it entails, and how you can apply. And you can be hopefully part of this great movement. And yeah, without the youth, we're not going to create any impact. So this is a little bit in a nutshell for now. I'm not going to take a lot of space from this floor, because there's this great workshop for you designed, which we're going to take on. But please email us. There's also a colleague of mine on the call, which is our youth leader, Silke. Don't hesitate to take on the chat with me or her, or get something filled in the website, and we'll take notice and get in touch with you. And hopefully we're going to see all these beautiful faces now online, but soon in NGIN, or in an NGIN activity, or in the UN Rome environment. Thank you for now, and thank you very much, Robin, and your colleagues and your team to facilitate this. And please take the floor to take it forward.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Sander. And I can see everyone's very enthusiastic about having this venue to discuss all of these important issues that are going on at the UN. And it's so exciting because there really is a new approach to hearing from youth. And I think this is exemplified at the United Nations, but in fact, all over the world. I see as we've continued to talk in the chat that people are really picking up those ideas about noting what sector they're in, to explain what kind of coalitions they've been involved in, like Act for Food during the Food Systems Summit. Wonderful to see people from FAO. And I loved the point, Sharon, that you made about encouraging people to look you up on LinkedIn. This is a great way to use the chat. And think about the fact that sometimes you'll be in virtual meetings for the UN, using that in a really thoughtful manner can be a way to create momentum for the issues you care about most. So let's talk a little bit about the United Nations. There are many, many places for you to be active in the world and to make a difference. A lot of you I can already see are active on the ground. And that kind of engagement is, of course, a place to make a meaningful engagement, to affect your communities. The UN is a space where you can affect macro policy. You know, it was founded right at the end of World War II in 1945. Many of you may know that there were 5 key countries who were given permanent seats at the Security Council, which is one of the famous bodies within the UN, and we'll be talking a little bit more about that structure in a moment. But basically the nuclear powers, the United States, Great Britain, France, Soviet Union, and China were given special status with permanent seats on the Security Council and a veto power regarding peace building matters. And then the other 46 member states all had 1 vote. Now, the Security Council gets a lot of attention, and obviously in these complicated times, and we're thinking of all the people who've been affected so horribly by war in the past few years and past few months, the Security Council gets a particular level of attention. But there's many other venues in which the UN engages, and in fact, many of them are important for totally different reasons than peace and security keeping. UN decisions, whether legally binding or not, so a resolution may be a thought the UN is putting forward, sort of like a motion in a meeting, but there may be actual treaties where countries are signing up to oblige themselves to do certain things. These are really moments that presage national rules and regulations. Occasionally, some countries are ahead of the UN, but on the whole, the UN, I submit to you, tends to be the thought leader, the space where the broadest collaboration is developed and founded. So this is a really important space for you to be engaged in. If you want to think about it, all we can imagine right now is the gravity of climate change. IPCC just released its most recent report on climate change, saying this is the moment to act. It is now or never. We understand this, but it was the UN who convened a meeting in the 1990s when no country was talking about carbon capture or carbon credits or tax and trade or flat out GHG emission reductions. It was the UN that led that conversation. And as difficult as it has been, and even in the face of the fact that we're not making as much progress as we need to, without that multilateral discussion, there never would have been any platform that got climate change into the global agenda and had countries talking through what they were going to do about it. So perfect or not, and we can all say multilateralism is imperfect. Even those at the highest levels of multilateralism will say that's imperfect. It is the space where we make international progress together. So I mentioned that there were 51 states, the 5 permanent seats plus 46 other members when the UN was first created. Governance is now done by 193 member states, and with the exception of the Security Council veto for deployment of peacekeeping matters, every country has 1 vote. This is an incredibly important principle. So whether you are the United States, that is the biggest single contributor to the UN, not always the most timely one, but the biggest single one, or whether you are a small island developing state, you each get 1 vote on the matters at the UN. And that's a principle that is really sacrosanct in the engagement. That's one of the reasons why you've seen a group called, you've probably heard of this, the G77, the group of 77 countries, plus China. It's actually a group of more than 100 countries. But over time, they've come together as a coalition to say that we as developing countries need more attention on the agenda at the UN, and they tend to take the floor on key matters together and to vote often as a bloc on certain matters. That's been an important development to get a new lens on how the UN should operate. And within that, we see many countries or regions working together. Won't surprise you that the EU often negotiates together, even though it's their individual member states who have the votes. By the same token, we've certainly seen the African continent. I noticed a number of you are from Africa. increasingly coming together and speaking as an African group. Or as I mentioned, small island developing states also taking the floor as a grouping. And we always have to remember it is the member states that have the vote. They are like the parliament of the United Nations. The people who have the vote are there. Non-state actors may engage as observers, and occasionally we are given the floor as non-state actors. Some of you may know that I've coordinated the private sector engagement at the UN Committee on Food Security. That's one kind of non-state actor. There's a civil society mechanism. If you look at the ECOSOC processes and the environmentally related processes, there are in fact multiple non-state actor groups, and many of which are allowed to take the floor. It's trade unions, there's a group for farmers. We would love to see lots of young farmers getting organized and getting engaged in some of these spaces. There's academic and they're engineering, or sometimes called science and technical major group. And so academics and engineers and food technologists and some of the experts we've seen on this list can also engage in that way. If you're a young entrepreneur, you can engage through business and industry. There are spaces for all sorts of actors, including NGOs, which is a huge group, and also local communities. So if you're active in your municipality or you're active in your city, you may be able to get them involved in the local government engagement. So there are many paths, many groupings of different actors, and some have very special status in some spaces, like the indigenous communities, particularly in all spaces, but particularly in those related to indigenous communities, have an extra special voice. But no non-state actor has a vote. So it's always a complex thing to navigate because you don't have a guaranteed slot, you don't have a guaranteed moment to take the floor, and you don't get to vote on the resolution or the negotiation in the end. So we're going to talk today a little bit about some of the ways that you can engage in that. The other thing I want you to remember is the UN agencies are sort of like the bureaucracy of the UN system. They're like the government departments that deliver the UN programming, while the governance comes from the member states. I hope that makes some sense. We'll come back and talk about some of those questions. Antonio Guterres, many of you have heard of, he's the Secretary General of the United Nations. He's from Portugal. Amina Mohammed is the Deputy Secretary of the General of the United Nations. She is from Nigeria. They work together very collaboratively, and many of the agriculture and food issues, including the recent Food Systems Summit, fell under the purview of Amina Mohammed. So she's an important name for you to remember. And these would be the most senior bureaucratic leaders of the United Nations. Important actors. And then I want to talk a little bit about some of the key bodies within the UN. There's the General Assembly. You've probably heard of it. You've seen the big marble dais where people speak in the green carpet. That is the place where all 193 countries come together. And they have separate committees that work on different issues. What they call their second committee meets and talks every year about food security. They have the Trusteeship Council, and this is an amazing part of the UN. We forget sometimes. Right after World War II, there were so many displaced people. There had been so many boundaries and countries redrawn. People didn't have passports. They didn't have a nationality. The UN trusteeship actually helped to place the refugees from around the world, to give them back sense of identity and nationality, and take all of these displaced people coming out of World War II. Let us hope that they aren't needed in the same way again, following all of the challenges that we've been having in the world. But that special council is a unique space. The Economic and Social Council. This is where a lot of the work is done. We talk about the Security Council a lot, where they're talking about peace building and the military arm of the UN that goes into try to enforce peace. But the Economic and Social Council is the place, sometimes known as ECOSOC, where they actually talk about a lot of the issues that will be relevant to you because of your interest in food and agriculture. So that's where they talk about things like youth. And there's a special youth event of ECOSOC that we will be discussing later on. Then, as I mentioned, the Security Council works on peace building. The Secretariat, this tall building you might have seen pictures of every time you see a movie where New York is, you may see this big tall building built by the Coursier. And that Secretariat is where Antonio Guterres and Amina Mohammed sit, as well as other core representatives of the UN bodies. And then they also have specialized agencies like the United Nations Environment Program, UNEP. You may have heard of UNESCO that's involved in education and culture. And we're going to talk about some of the ones that are related most specifically to food and agriculture in a few minutes. And so those departments do specialized work and they're located all over the world. And then there's also the International Court of Justice, a key venue to tackle some of the difficult issues related, for instance, to war crimes. So when we think about how people come together, here we are, there's a picture of the General Assembly. 193 countries are sitting there, and they will adopt a resolution. A UN resolution is really a formal text. It does kind of look like a motion at a meeting. We agree that youth need to be accelerated, that more attention needs to go to land transfer for youth, and that all countries should do more to make sure that agricultural educations are available to youth. Or they might pass, that's just a sample, they might pass a motion on something related to women. The UN Commission on the Status of Women just finished meeting last month, and they actually passed a multi-page resolution about some of the things that need to happen to help women cope with climate change. The process is always debated and negotiating is always part of the reality at the UN. So you will see very formal interventions where countries take the floor, they'll have their name in front of them. I'm from Canada, so let's imagine it's like Canada or the Netherlands, like Sandra's from, and that country takes the floor, states its position, and then the negotiating happens as the chair begins to hear the different positions and then suggest different language. And it's always really complicated because even if these are non-binding treaties about, for instance, how much plastic waste is allowed to go in the oceans, they're going to be negotiating a new treaty on that. Whether it's a motion or a formally legally binding treaty, consensus is part of the premise. So you really need to get the will of the room with you. And if something does not have broad-based consensus, it won't get included in the material. So one of the things you find when you're working with the UN is you need to talk to lots of different actors, lots of different countries to get that consensus built. And this is really important because there are a number of ways that you can help to build relationships at the UN. It must always seem so daunting when you as a young person are beginning to engage in this process. And the reason why we're going to run through some of this history and some of these techniques and then talk to you a little bit more about the SDGs and some of the specific youth venues is that as a non-state actor, as a young person, you really have to work through different processes and work hard to get a chance to engage. So let's talk a little bit about some of those opportunities are. UN meetings and conferences are key opportunities to attend. There's usually a calendar of activities that goes on throughout the year on a whole range of given topics. For instance, you may be aware that around November each year, they have a huge meeting called the UNFCCC, which is the Framework Convention on Climate Change. Those are the climate change negotiations you heard about in Glasgow last year. They're going to be in November in Egypt this year. So there are moments when you know that there will be key meetings and key opportunities to engage. That's a chance for you to think about, where do you want to be? It could be the UN Committee on Food Security, because that's a smaller meeting, more focused just on food and agriculture. But you should think about spaces that you want to engage and ways in which you can engage in them by being in some of these major groups. UN negotiations. So country negotiators will come together, sometimes outside those meetings and conferences. Often they'll work for months and months and months before the big formal meeting when all the cameras are on, to try and negotiate an agreement. So one thing I want you to remember is, as you are beginning to work on encouraging youth in food and agriculture and thinking about policy positions that you want to take in that space, often your most important engagement can be early in the process. The sooner you talk to countries and encourage them to be including references to youth in their documents, the more likely you are to have success. If you wait until, let's say, the climate change negotiations, if you wait until Egypt to say that it's important for agriculture and food systems to be included in the climate change negotiations, it will be too late, because they will have already been working for months and months and months on what's going to be agreed there. And it doesn't mean that there aren't problem areas that they're still working on. Getting emission cuts are, for example, they are negotiating those around the clock until the 11th hour. But if you want to be engaged in this, you need to be thinking about the technical meetings that they have in June beforehand. You need to be thinking about a process and seeding the importance of your issue very early on. As well, there are UN plenary sessions. So this often happens in New York, where the General Assembly convenes, and there may be an opportunity to work with your own member state to reach out to the agriculture ministry there and ask them to ask the ambassador to speak about something important about youth in agriculture. Or you might be able to write your ambassador and say it would be important to have that opportunity to talk about rural youth who get left behind too often and too often experience multidimensional poverty. But having something specific to say and then helping countries to understand why they should raise it is really powerful tool, because you yourselves will not be able to take the floor in a UN plenary. There are occasional moments where youth are asked to come and speak, to kick off an event, to bring a perspective. But when it comes to the negotiating, it will always be those member states. You always need to think about how you are engaging with your country and other countries to build up that attention, that spotlight on the things you need to be the next generation in agriculture. The other thing is to say that bilaterals are very important to achieve that. So bilaterals are a one-on-one meeting with a country mission. It could be the advisors, the alternates, the ministers. You could even argue that a bilateral would include a UN agency, like a bilateral with Sharon, who's on the line from FAO, or a bilateral with Kazuki, who's working on World Food Forum. There could be ways in which you have meetings. Those meetings are different than the big meetings where you have lots and lots of countries at the table. A bilateral meeting is between your perhaps youth group, and it is important to organize yourselves in youth groups to encourage the likelihood that you'll get those meetings. But NGIN could ask for a meeting with an ambassador. I'll use that example of the Netherlands. They've been very supportive in getting youth engaged, and that's an opportunity for you to go as NGIN, explain what NGIN is and all the groups that are made up of it, and some of the things that you would like to have advanced. So using and setting up those bilateral meetings before the UN meetings is really important, and you may want to do some of it in the margins of the UN meetings. But usually those ambassadors are very busy in the meeting rooms throughout that process. Another key way to get your voice heard is side events. Side events are literally in the side of these major UN meetings. So they often have negotiating times. In New York, it's typically 10 a.m. until 1 p.m. in New York time, and 3 p.m. till 6 p.m. So 2 3-hour sessions, and then they use the time in the morning at the extended lunch and in the evenings to meet as regional groups to agree their own positions, to do side events. And you may have an opportunity to apply for a side event. And this is where non-state actors can set an agenda that they get their voices heard at the UN. So I've given you a lot of information about the history of the UN. I want to just observe that a couple of things. There is an email to express interest in NGIN, and it's in the chat. I'll get Steve to put it in the chat again just right now so that people can catch that. And we're going to talk a little bit more about the Rome-based agencies in the next couple of segments. But before we do, I want to see how well you've done at absorbing some of the background about the UN. So Priscilla, I'm going to ask you to help me put up a poll. Here's a quick quiz. What year was the UN founded? 1935, 1945, 1948, 1918. Let's see what people are thinking. Great, I see lots of people answering the poll. We're going to give it a few more minutes, or a few more moments rather. And we won't be able to see what your answer was, so don't worry about guessing. Fantastic, let's end that poll. Great, so we're just sharing the results now. I'm happy to say that the vast majority of you remembered 1945 as the starting year that following World War II, the world came together to begin a new chapter in multilateralism. And for some of you who were thinking about that period in between World War I and World War II, the League of Nations was a precursor to the UN. So you might have remembered a little bit of that history. Let's try the next poll. Let's think a little bit about if you want to be engaged in a topic. And I'll get you to pull up the next quiz. There we go. Which part of the UN is dedicated to the discussion of the environment? UNESCO, UNDP, UNEP, UNU. Great. And I see more of you answering. One of the things you'll find is at the United Nations, it is, I call it alphabet soup sometimes. Everything is an acronym. So getting to know those acronyms and not hesitating to quickly throw them into Google and get an answer on what they are is really super important. It will help you navigate where to go. Fantastic. So I'm happy to say that the vast majority of you, again, proved to be very insightful. The United Nations Environment Program, UNEP, is the body that works on environmental negotiations. Some of you voted for UNESCO. I had mentioned UNESCO. Sorry if I confused you there, but that does education and culture. They're the ones who create World Historical Sites at the Great Pyramids of Giza and in many beautiful spaces. And they also are big advocates for education, so important for youth as well. United Nations Development Program, some of you also answered, and the development program works on trying to alleviate poverty as its primary mandate, which also has an intersection. So great job, everybody. So with that in mind, we're going to talk next a little bit about the Sustainable Development Goals, which touch on several of the things, including education and poverty, as well as food security. I'm going to ask my colleague Mumbi to join me on the screen and take us through a great interactive session. We're going to need your thoughts. Over to you, Mumbi.
Thank you so much, Robin, and thank you for handing over to me. If you have thank you so much. I was just about to ask about the PowerPoint. And thank you all so much. It's excellent to have youth on the call and have such an exciting chat function. We can see where everyone is from, the kind of work that everyone's doing in agriculture. So we can see we've got a great cross section of sectors, all the way from, I've seen some animal husbandry, I've seen some education. So really a cross section that in a way mimics the cross section we're just about to discuss on the Sustainable Development Goals. So I'll start with a bit of an introduction to the Sustainable Development Goals. And I just want to note we'll have a few more polls coming up. So if you can keep your fingers ready, we'll have a bit of engagement. But before we get there, let's begin with an introduction to the Sustainable Development Goals and Agenda 2030. So many of you have probably already engaged with these goals, but they serve as the blueprint towards sustainable development and a sustainable future for all. So they focus on economic and social development, and they really, Priscilla, next slide, please. Yes, so these are the universal goals that are set by the UN, and they were set in 2015. They replaced what were the Millennial Development Goals and actually built upon them. So these goals will address social, economic, and environmental challenges. So these are the primary goals for the entire UN system, and donors, and even us as non-state actors as we engage in the UN. These are primarily the goals that we use to engage in until 2030. So as I noted, the goals were agreed in September 2015 at the SDG Summit, and they replaced what was before the Millennium Development Goals and actually built upon them. Next slide, please, Priscilla. So each of the goals, and we'll shortly have a bit of an engagement on the goals themselves, but in terms of the structure of how these goals are structured and how they are implemented. So there's each of the 17 SDGs, as you know, for instance, poverty. So there's this SDG itself. Each SDG then has a number of targets. So there's 169 targets in total for all the 17 SDGs, but you might find, for example, SDG 2 has 9 targets. In addition to the targets, each SDG has a number of indicators. So these indicators are what are used in order to be able to follow up and review progress. So the target is what they'd like to reach, and then the indicator is how they're used to measure whether they've reached their target. So in terms of when you go to the bottom, implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals is via national planning processes, via policies, via strategies and frameworks, and then there's also measuring and monitoring. So at the higher level, you have the SDGs, you have the global policy, but when it trickles down, you then have this implemented at the national and local level. And indeed, some of the work that all of you are doing directly feeds into this SDGs and into us achieving Agenda 2030. Next slide, please. Oh, I think we're having a challenge. Thank you. We're changing the slides. All right, so these are the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. As you can see, they cover a cross-section all the way from poverty and hunger, moving to health and well-being, talking about institutions and talking about partnerships. So a key note when you think, for instance, about SDG 17 is that all the goals are interconnected. So when you're in a forum that's discussing good health and well-being, you can actually quite easily bring in climate action or affordable and clean energy. So even though we discuss this SDGs and we have them as individual standalones, the implementation of each of the SDGs is interlinked. And going back to that question that Robin just asked us about which forum focuses on the environment, indeed it is the UN Environment Programme, but you will find a cross-section across all the other discussions related to the SDGs, you find that you can really discuss and bring in all the other goals. So even in your daily work, I'm sure you can see, for instance, that perhaps you're working on affordable and clean energy, but when you do that, you're probably also working on life on land, on climate action, on zero hunger. So the interconnectedness of the goals, as well as their relevance both to developing countries and developed countries, is one of the key tenets of these goals. Next slide, please. Thanks, Robin. So just for the purposes of showing how the goals are structured, we're going to use SDG 2 as an example, which is around zero hunger. So this is what SDG 2 is framed as. It's calling on countries to end hunger, achieve food security, improve nutrition, and promote sustainable agriculture by 2030. As I noted, SDG 2 has 8 targets. So it's really talking about hunger, food security, nutrition, sustainable agriculture, which, as you can see, is quite a broad cross-section of issues. And then next slide, please. So when you go into SDG 2 in particular, so it has a number of goals that are, as you can see, cross-section a number of issues. So for instance, they're talking about ending hunger, ending malnutrition, doubling the productivity of small-scale farmers, ensuring a sustainable production system, maintaining the diversity of seeds, plants, farmed, and domesticated animals. So as you can see, this covers the whole broad section of agriculture, and then also feeds into other of the SDGs as we've seen. For instance, we have nutrition, which also feeds into the goal on sustainable consumption and production, feeds into the goal around zero hunger, feeds into the goal around no poverty. So you can see how those are interconnected. Next slide, please. So in terms of the Sustainable Development Goals and the process for review, these goals are reviewed annually through a forum that's called the High Level Political Forum. It's held annually in July. And the way it's structured is they tend to select a goal or 2 to 3 goals that are then reviewed at each annual forum. For instance, this year, they're going to be reviewing the goal around life on land, which really talks about biodiversity and ecosystems and how we really promote and maintain those. So the annual meeting does provide opportunities for private sector and other non-state actors. So all of us here in the group, I know we do have some representatives from FAO, for instance, but most of us as youth or as private sector and as the work we do are classified as non-state actors. During this high-level political forum, there's usually member states can provide voluntary updates on how they're doing towards the implementation of the particular SDG under review. And it really just goes into in-depth for the SDGs chosen. This is where they review how far are we in terms of implementing those targets. Are we in line with those indicators? What is being done in local and nations towards those SDGs? And this is the forum for that. Next slide, please. So now we're going to go into a bit of an interactive portion in terms of getting in terms of understanding how these goals are interacted or worked upon within the UN. For this portion, I will ask Robin to join me on this figurative stage that we're on, and we'll together go through a bit of an interactive session where we'll do some polls to see, first of all, the areas or the goals that are particularly of interest to you as youth. And we'll have a bit of a discussion around how, what do we think the ways are to better engage youth in this particular goals of interest. So next slide, please. And I'll just talk a bit about the structure of the poll and how we'll do it. So each poll will be asking you which of a number of goals. So we've grouped them into 3, but which of a number of goals would interest you the most? As we have that poll run, we'd like you to think and promote in chat what policies would be needed to advance youth engagement in that SDG. For instance, let's say we have goal 2 around zero hunger, and that's what we find comes out as the most interesting SDG for you. You could, for instance, put in chat that it's important to encourage youth and young people to be engaged in farming or to work with small-scale farmers. How do we bring in youth to that? When we think of quality education, you might want to talk about having specific programs around youth. Indeed, maybe you want education that's more digital, more in line with young people and their areas of interest. Maybe perhaps we even want education around some of this social media and engagement and how those channels can be used for that type of engagement. So as we're just going to pull up the poll, and Priscilla, you can pull up that poll, but I'd like to see you as youth put in chat how you see. Okay, let's begin. So our first poll focuses around goal 1 to goal 6. So I just ask you, and of course there's no correct answer, there's no wrong answer. Just select one of the 6 that you most resonate with. It might be the goal that you have work in. It might be the goal that you want to see more engagement under. And then Robin and I on this figurative stage will discuss the ways that UN has programs in these areas. And as we do that, we'd also like you to discuss the ways that you as youth can be better engaged in this goal and its policy. All right, I'll just give you a few more minutes to answer. And as we have this, have you answer this poll, perhaps I can hand it to you, Robin. We had a question come through in chat a bit earlier around the intersection between CFS and SSS. Perhaps you can answer that question as we just give the youth some time to answer this poll.
Excellent. Well, and I will be touching on this because we'll be talking about CFS in detail in the next segment. So I'll elaborate on that. But I mean, a great example about the Food Systems Summit is that it touched on so many areas. So as we're seeing the votes come in about which goal they'd like to talk about and be most engaged in, you could see that the Food Systems Summit didn't just talk about zero hunger, it talked about zero poverty. You can think about all the ways these things are involved. In the follow-up to the Food Systems Summit, the FAO has been asked to be the organizer for a UN engagement that will span across the world. And one of the key areas of intersection will be that the UN resident coordinator, so there's one person in each country where the UN has a lead coordinator in every developing country. They will be charged with helping to implement the national priorities that were set by that country during the Food Systems Summit. So I really do encourage you, and I think we have some people from lots of great countries. I noticed somebody from Nepal was talking about this. There is really that chance to go to the UN resident coordinator in Nepal and or the FAO leader in Nepal and talk a little bit about what you can do to get youth more engaged and how the country's prioritizing youth in the context of this. So there's some really concrete ways to follow up.
Thanks so much, Robin. And you must have known what would come up in the poll because we have had most interest in goals 2 around zero hunger. So 75% of you are interested in the goal around zero hunger. So maybe as we just discuss the ways that UN has programs in this area, you can just, as we discuss, put for me in chat how you think youth can be best engaged in this goal around zero hunger. How can youth help achieve that goal towards 2030? And we're just looking forward to seeing what you put in chat. But as we have you engage in chat as well, we want to think about what are some of the programs that the UN has around zero hunger and what are some of the ways they engage. So Robin just now has talked about the Food Systems Summit, which was the first of its kind that was held last year. I think it discussed zero hunger as one of its main things, but of course also brought in sustainable consumption and production, brought in goals around climate, but that as well. We also have the annual Committee on Food Security, which Robin has raised and will be talked about a bit later on, but really just thinking about some of the ways that the UN discusses zero hunger. Robin, do you want to come in and add in a bit of context for some of that engagement?
Absolutely. I mean, one of the things that we can see right now is that zero hunger is top of mind, right? We're looking at a situation that food prices have been rising due to COVID. Now we have global instability amongst major food exporters. Zero hunger is very top of mind. The World Food Program, which we'll talk about more in a little bit, is on the front lines of delivering food aid. If you are interested in getting engaged, the World Food Program needs, straight up, it needs more money. So campaigning and encouraging and tweeting and encouraging others to think about putting money into the World Food Program is a way to tackle zero hunger. We are going to talk quite a bit more about the UN Committee on Food Security, which is, of course, as the name implies, centrally engaged in SDG 2, as are all of the Rome-based agencies. So there really is that opportunity. And I think in chat, it is excellent to see Colton talking about the systems that will address zero hunger, directly affect poverty, gender equality, health. This is such a difficult set of SDGs to choose from because all of them are so important. And I think one of the opportunities we have is to make that intersection, as he's saying there in the chat, to show that if you address food security by improving this livelihoods of smallholder farmers, you address goal 1 on poverty, and you address inequality on gender because so many women are smallholder farmers. So there are ways to tackle all of these issues. I see some people voted for clean water and sanitation. One of the things that people often forget is if you don't have clean water and good sanitation, you get the diarrheal diseases and the health challenges that mean that you can eat food, but you aren't retaining that nutrition. It's washing through you literally. And so you will not achieve zero hunger if you don't have water and sanitation supporting you. So bringing that importance of clean water and sanitation into the zero hunger discussion, which is often just, get more food into people's hands. And of course, that's definitely part of the solution. It's bringing those kinds of ideas in. So we'd love to continue seeing you in chat add in some more examples of what you'd like to call for youth on zero hunger. Do you need more access to land tenure?
Yeah, thank you so much, Robin. And that's indeed some excellent context. And in fact, as we think, it's really difficult to split this SDGs. And I think it's quite interesting that we have zero hunger and sustainable consumption and production. We're going to test them differently. Sometimes you do find that when you're in an African audience, zero hunger will probably be the most important SDG. But when you're in another context, and perhaps you might be in a different context, you might find that SDG 12 around sustainable and consumption and production might be the one that might be of most interest, in that they're both important in both contexts, but sometimes some might be more important than others or indeed sometimes mirror each other. You might find, for instance, in urban areas, you need to talk about SCP, sustainable consumption and production, as per SDG 12. But when you're in a rural area, you need to think more about zero hunger and how we can get people having even more nutrients. So always remembering as we talk about SDGs, the difference in the context as well will really affect how that's implemented. All right, so that's our first set of SDGs, and really well done on choosing. And I'm seeing some interesting things come up in chat, and Steve has shared with us the Global Environment Outlook 6 for Youth, which was produced by the UN Environment Program that we talked about earlier. And it does have a bit of information around sustainable consumption and production, sustainable careers for youth. So just some exciting things of how youth can engage. Also, I see someone has just talked about advancing research and proposing strong policies. I think that's excellent. So having more science and technology research, having more information about that. And in fact, there is actually an annual Science, Technology and Innovation Forum that's held within the UN context to really talk exactly about that and how we have science and technology contribute to fulfilling the Sustainable Development Goals. So let's move to our next set. Priscilla, if you can just pull up that second poll for me. So we've got another set of 6 goals, so we can go into them and see a bit both what you're particularly engaged in, as well as see how the UN implements these. So we have goals 7 to 12, and we'll just give you again some time to look through and see what's of most interest. There is no right answer. We just want a forum or a platform by which to discuss some of these goals and engage with them a bit more. So here we have talking about affordable and clean energy. So that's where you think about solar energy, for instance. We talk about decent work and economic growth. That Global Environment Outlook that I just referenced actually had a specific chapter around careers for youth and what we think about decent work and economic growth. We have around industry, innovation, and infrastructure. We have goal 10 around reduced inequality. We have goal 11 around sustainable cities and communities, and what does it mean to youth when we say sustainable cities and communities? And then goal 12, which I was just explaining, is sometimes a mirror or an inverse, but not really, because they work together around SCP, that's sustainable consumption and production. So if we've had everyone answer, I'll just give it 1 or 2 more minutes, and then we'll be able to share the poll and do some discussion around that particular goal. Priscilla, does it look like we have most people answered? We can actually share that result. All right, let's see. Oh, interesting. This has come out quite an interesting mix in that we have 2 goals that are really quite close together. And then we also have not too far off around reduced inequality and sustainable cities. So why don't we begin? Let's talk about goal 12, which came out in the lead, which is responsible consumption and production. And then we'll talk about goal 8 as well, and then we'll touch a bit on some of the others. So when we think of goal 12 on consumption and production, first of all, I'd really like all of you to put in chat once again, what are the ways we can engage youth in responsible consumption and production? What is the role of youth in this, and what policies can better engage them in this? Not to talk too much about the Food System Summit, but we had the Food System Summit that was held last year. And one of the action areas was actually around responsible consumption and production. And as you know, I know we have people here, for instance, who are engaged in animal husbandry and similar. There's quite a number of different understandings of what sustainable consumption and production is. So for instance, there are some parties who have the view that sustainable consumption does not include dairy, does not include animal products. And then there's, of course, the other view when you think of communities that might have micronutrient deficiencies, where they might actually need more of this type of consumption and production. So really, when you're thinking of responsible consumption and production, you really need to have, again, that balanced view that it's really quite different and quite context specific. And so trying to have that balance as we move towards sustainable consumption and production, but at the same time realizing that for that to be responsible, there are some communities that, for instance, are producing too much GHG emissions and some that are producing too little, some that are not contributing, so to speak. So we want them to develop without increasing their GHG emissions, but they still need to have some form of sustainable consumption. So for instance, you're thinking about Africa. So in Africa, we would need, most countries would need to increase their, with growing populations, we need to increase our food production, but at the same time, we do still need to manage our GHG emissions and that development. So that's a bit on SCP, and I'm really excited to see the interest that all of you had in that. I hope we didn't guide you towards that. But Robin, maybe you can talk a bit about some of those other areas that came up for interest.
Absolutely. And just to mention on SCP, the great things in the chat about the need for consumer education, the need for subsidization to get youth into the systems, the need for recycling and reuse. Responsible consumption and production sort of lives at the United Nations Environment Program. It's of course important across the UN, but they're particularly engaged there. And the SDG 12.3 is on food loss and waste. And there's actually a whole working group on 12.3 on food loss and waste that would love to have more youth engagement. And you just have to look at that. World Resources Institute is an NGO that leads a lot of that work. So great opportunities there. On decent work and economic growth, and a shout out to Hannah for actually saying we need to overcome the challenges for young farmers to enter into the system. She mentions Europe and United States, although I think that's true actually for much of the world. Intergenerational transfer of farming is really difficult. And the International Labor Organization is doing quite a bit of work on decent work and economic growth, ILO. And we now have Gilbert Hungabo leaving IFAD to go to ILO. So with his agricultural background, I think that will be more important. And it's also a coalition that came out of the Food System Summit on decent livelihoods. And this is often challenging because food and agriculture has the highest level of SME engagement, right? Whether you're owning a tea cart, or whether you're a farmer, or whether you're in a restaurant business, lots of people work for themselves, so they may not be labor in a conventional way, though there's lots of agricultural and food labor. But thinking about the whole of how we get a decent livelihood for people is really important. So we encourage you to look at some of that decent livelihoods work. Great place to be.
Thank you so much, Robin, for that context. And in fact, we've talked quite a lot about the UN Environment Program, but it's a reflection of the goals that we've selected. And I think it's quite clear that we have agriculture actors here because we've talked about hunger, we've talked about consumption and production. And I think that's quite exciting. Another note, for instance, is that UNEP convenes the UN Environment Assembly, which is the highest discussion on the environment. And at their 4th session, which was in 2019, they had a theme around innovative solutions to sustainable development, so really wanting to touch on technology, but they had a dual theme because they also covered sustainable consumption and production. And out of that, there was a number of key resolutions and decisions that came up towards sustainable consumption and production that involved all sorts of issues across the agricultural value chain. So for instance, how do we sustainably use crop inputs? How do we sustainably use, for instance, lakes and rivers and ecosystems and biodiversity? So just some of the issues that came up. So really excited to see such a vibrant chat and what's coming up with all of you, and seeing how much you're interested in working in this goal. So it's really exciting to see that. So what we'll do is we'll move into our last set of goals again and have you think into this last set of goals and see what will come up as areas of interest. Thank you, Priscilla, for sharing that poll. So here we just have about 5 goals. And as you can see, some of these goals actually seem to be quite, well, not similar, but they're all really talking about biodiversity. They're talking about ecosystems. We're talking about climate. And then we have 2 at the end there. They're talking about institutions and partnerships. So we have goal 13 on climate action. We have goal 14 on life below water. So you're thinking about lakes, you're thinking about oceans. We have goal 15 on life on land. So you're thinking about ecosystems, rainforests, rangelands, those types of issues. And then goal 16, you're talking about peace, justice, and strong institutions. And indeed, as Robin noted, when the UN was first set up, this was almost the key thing it was working on. So coming up at the end of a world war, this was the key thing we had the UN focusing on. And then goal 17 is what we really touched on. It's around partnerships. So partnerships is around having a multi-stakeholder engagement in each of the goals. So having us, for instance, as non-state actors, either as farmers or as private sector or as youth, which are all different ways that we are grouped in the ways that we engage with the UN system. And also, I think partnerships really spark us to think about the interconnectedness across the goals. So I think we've had most of you answer. I'm really looking forward to see whether we'll have a clear lead as we did in the first, or we'll have, interesting, we do have a clear lead. So it seems most of you are interested around goal 13 on climate action. I would say this is one of the key issues of our time, so I'm not surprised that that will come up. But we also have a bit about partnerships and peace and justice. I know no one voted for life below water or life on land. I'd say that in voting goal 13, you have covered that a bit. But just to note, as I noted earlier, this year, the High-Level Political Forum will be reviewing goal 15 around life on land. So we'll really be talking quite a bit about ecosystems and biodiversity. But in terms of goal 13 on climate action, I'll just note that please put in chat how we can engage youth even more in climate action and how we can ensure that their views are included. But one of the ways that the UN discusses climate action, and they are numerous. So I'll just talk about one, and then Robin, you can bring up 2 or 3. So every year we have the UN General Assembly in September. And as part of that, there's also a week that's called the Climate Week, which is mainly a showcase of the ways that the Sustainable Development Goal around climate is being implemented and what countries are doing in this goal. In terms of partnerships, just to touch a bit, there's also every year the Partnership Forum, where we talk about how multi-stakeholders, so state actors, which we know are the key negotiating actor within the UN system, but also non-state actors like us, talk about the ways that partnerships can be used to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. So I'll just touch a bit, but I'll hand it over to Robin on my stage to talk a bit more about some of those other processes, UNFCCC, COP, and some of those other ways. Over to you, Robin.
Thanks. Well, UNFCCC is the obvious place to talk about goal 13. That is where they do the climate negotiations. And you might have heard the reference to COP, which Mumbi made. COP stands for Conference of Parties. So that means it's the negotiating meeting where they are negotiating the specific framework. So that is the space, and it's a COP for UNFCCC. They're not 2 separate things. There are COPs also for things like biodiversity. There was just a conference of parties related to the preparations for the biodiversity negotiations. So that's UN speak for a special kind of meeting that has a very special status. And indeed, thinking about how to get engaged heading into the climate change negotiations, encouraging them, even starting now with your own social handle feeds, to encourage that there be a discussion about food systems and that there be ongoing negotiations within the climate change discussions about agriculture is really important. 10 years ago, a group of us in the agri-food sector started campaigning that food should be included in the climate change negotiations. And back then, nobody even wanted to talk about it. Just 2 years ago, they began to include it in the discussions. So I think it's great to see this chat. A big shout out to Hannah and Lucy and Kamau, who just come in and started citing specific things that you want, because I think it's really important. If you go to climate action, yes, you want climate action, but really, what are you asking for? The inclusion of agriculture, more use of carbon sequestration techniques on farms. You need to think about what you as youth want to get included in these processes. Back to you, Mumbi.
Thank you so much, Robin, for that. So we really wanted to talk about the Sustainable Development Goals, but in a way that shows the way that both they are implemented and they are used in action, but also the ways that you as youth are fundamental towards the implementation and ways that you can find the policy system can serve you better. So as we continue in this engagement and we talk about upcoming events and ways we can engage youth, we really want to remember that mirror of the Sustainable Development Goals. And in the work that you do daily, in your Twitter posts, in your agriculture, you're all really very much contributing to that Sustainable Development Goal in a local and even individual context. So thank you for that portion of the session. In the next session, I'll be handing it over to Robin, who will take us through some of those key agencies, talking about CFS and some upcoming events. I see that there's some question and answers in the function, but we'll just talk through this portion and then we'll do specific question and answers. So if you want to ask a question, you can start typing it and we're seeing all of them and we'll deal with them at the end of the session. Thank you so much for your time with me. Over to you, Robin.
Thanks, Mumbi, and thank you, everyone. That was a really fun session. So let's pop on to the discussion about some of these key agencies. This has come up already, and we'll want to just talk a little bit about Rome-based agencies. Again, another acronym, but if you're going to swim in this world, you're going to need to know a few of these. Rome-based agencies are literally, as the name implies, they are based in Rome, Italy. And so they're sometimes called the Rome-based agencies because clustered there are 3 UN bodies that focus on food and agricultural issues. The famous and most oldest is, of course, the Food and Agriculture Organization of the UN, FAO, or FAO. That is the primary body that deals with food and agriculture in the United Nations. And then there are specialized agencies that add additional resources into the sector. IFAD, the International Fund for Agricultural Development, is, as the name fund implies, a monetary lending institution that from the UN to countries, so you as an individual don't get a loan, but your country, Nepal, Rwanda, whomever, could get a loan from IFAD to work on agricultural development. So that's really an important body. And World Food Program, whom I mentioned earlier in the context of zero hunger. The World Food Program is the frontline aid delivery body to get food into the hands of hungry, especially in high risk, high conflict situations. So the leaders of those groups are Dr. Dongyu Chu from China, is the head of the Food and Agriculture Organization. He is their Director General and is a trained agronomist. It's so exciting to see somebody with those kinds of technical skills leading an agency. I mentioned Gilbert Hungbo. I've left him here because he is now the outgoing president of IFAD. He was just recently elected the president of the International Labour Organization. So there will now be a new election for the International Fund for Agriculture Development. And this comes at a difficult time because IFAD is also in the process of a fundraise to get a new batch of monies to be able to make loans to countries to actually do agricultural development. With regards to David Beasley, he's been very high profile lately. Many of you may have seen the exchange with Elon Musk about taking 2% of his wealth and being able to feed the world. he has been putting himself out there because the need is going up so quickly for World Food Program. We don't yet know the full consequences of how many additional people will go hungry and the echo of the current situation. But these three men, and I will note they're all men, there's never been a female Secretary General of the UN. All three of these people are men. There has been female leaders of the World Food Program, but it's an ongoing challenge on gender equity, but you'll see great regional diversity. And these people are very important to making food policy on the go forward. So as I said, Food and Agriculture Organization, they produce all the statistics that help us understand the state of hunger and malnutrition, do early warning systems on pest pressures and crop diseases, and they support countries in making commitments to food security and good nutrition. In the chat earlier, we had someone saying we should support healthier choices in urban areas. That's a great example of something you can take to FAO. We've also talked a little bit about the UN Committee on Food Security, which is resourced through the FAO, EFAD, and the World Food Program. So each of those groups donate staff to the UN Committee on Food Security. They assign staff to them. And then the committee is actually not an agency itself. It is a committee of the UN that's authorized by the General Assembly and the Economic Social Council and by a FAO conference, which is the member states that oversee FAO. So this means that each country has a seat at the table. And the thing that's really special about CFS is it is meant to be an inclusive international and intergovernmental program. And they allow the civil society, private sector, academia, and foundations to have a seat at the table along with international financial institutions. And that means that unlike almost any other UN process, you can actually take the floor, you can provide ideas and thoughts and suggested text to negotiations. It's a very unique space. And as we already saw from the vote on goal 2, we're here because we all care about food and agriculture. This is a space dedicated to food and agriculture and nutrition. So it's a really important opportunity to work together on the core issues. So let's talk a little bit about how it's organized. It's a bit complicated, but don't be intimidated. It's really about knowing what you want and then being able to intersect. So CFS decides its priority issues. Right now, it's working on gender empowerment, an issue where I noticed nobody voted for gender equality in those SDGs for number 5. It's a super important issue for all of us in agriculture and food. So what they do is once they pick a topic, then it goes to a high-level panel of experts. They pick special scientists and social scientists to help provide a foundational report that helps to inform this entire process. Then that gets reported back to the CFS plenary, and then sort of a working group that they elect called the Bureau, which is sort of like their executive, their board, sets up an open-ended working group. Oh my goodness, what is an open-ended working group? Basically, they choose somebody to chair. And right now, Panama and Finland are chairing the open-ended working group to help negotiate voluntary guidelines that every country in the world will sign on to that should say how they can better achieve gender equality for food system and food security and nutrition. The work of that open-ended working group is supported by a technical task team that helps draft a document, rewrite a document as the work goes on, getting feedback. And then finally, all of that goes into a big meeting when CFS has its plenary session in October each year, and they will review that document and approve it. But the thing is, the work on that document's been going on for 2 years, including the most recent new document that just came out a couple of weeks ago. And so you really have to be paying attention. If you get to October and then you say, hey, I would like such and such included, the odds are very low that you'll get it included in October. You have to start early. This is super important to all of you because they are also working on policy recommendations specifically related to youth. And before this meeting, we circulated a 4-page document that is the basis of the negotiations, the quote zero draft, which means that nobody's discussed it. It's the first draft that the chair of the open-ended working group, in this case, that's the ambassador of Switzerland, Pio Webenust, His Excellency, has helped to draft to talk about youth policies. So we really want you to look at that document, to think about things that you want in that document, like intergenerational transfer. So the document came out in January. They've had a first meeting to get some input from everybody on the floor about things they want, and then those were also given a chance to provide written submissions. So both civil society mechanism and private sector mechanism can put in. I will admit, on a personal level, it's not an official position, but on a personal level, I was hoping that there would also be a youth group set up, but the existing structures are the way in which they're engaging. So you can engage with either of those bodies or the academic group, which is coordinated by the CG system. So get your thoughts in. Then on April 15th, they're going to publish a new draft document, and then they'll begin negotiations May 30th to June 1st and July 4th to 6th to actually agree what should be included there. And then that will be endorsed in October. So this goes back to my observation that if you want to be engaged in these things, you need to start early. You need to get engaged when they're having regional meetings, when they're calling for draft inputs to the high-level panel of experts. You want to look for those calls of action, and you also want to find portals of entry, like these coordinating groups, that allow you to get heard. Another special thing is that every member state has been encouraged to include youth in their delegation for this discussion, and potentially to give the seat to youth for this discussion. So for instance, with the question about Nepal, it might be worth reaching out to the Nepalese ambassador to FAO and ask if they are setting up youth participation in the youth negotiation. And maybe you could take the chair. Again, full credit to Netherlands. They did this very early on in the process when there was a campaign underway to get youth onto the agenda at CFS. And then many other countries allowed youth to take the floor. Dominican Republic, Canada, others allowed youth to have a moment to actually themselves take the floor from their country's seat. It's a very special arrangement, and you need special permission, but we encourage you to talk to your member state. And the topics are actually sort of laid out in 5 key areas: youth rights, securing dignified and rewarding livelihoods, increasing equitable access to resources. This goes to the question about, maybe subsidizing youth to get into positions of engagement. In Indonesia, there's actually a program where youth are allowed to come in and get preferred access to land if they graduated from agricultural college, enhance knowledge and education, and foster sustainable development and inclusion. And for ECOSOC, there are also a special youth event. So that's CFS, and they're negotiating youth right now. We'd love to see you get engaged. Then if you are interested in ECOSOC Youth Forum, that's actually coming up this April. It's a platform to engage with member states. It's not specifically on SDG 2, but they are talking about life on land. So that's another great opportunity that you can watch each year. And then the FAO has helped set up the World Food Forum, which this year coming up will be October 3rd to 5th. It was conceived by the Youth Committee at FAO, and it's started to assemble a whole set of youth partners, including youth scientists doing special advising to the FAO. I really encourage you to go visit their website and start signing up for things and getting involved in some of what they're doing, because there's so much great activity here, and it is again a chance to shine a light on youth engagement. So I know time is coming up tight. We had a really robust discussion on the SDGs, but let's take a few questions that we've seen coming up so far. So as I understand it, that we've got lots of questions about how Food Systems Summit and CFS work together. So I talked a little bit about CFS. CFS is permanent. The Food Systems Summit was a special one-time event. Every 2 years, they will do some follow-up activities on the Food Systems Summit. So you'll want to continue to watch those coalitions like the Zero Hunger Coalition. And that'll be a great opportunity to get engaged. But CFS is obviously also working on several of those things. It isn't necessarily the only place where Food Systems Summit follow-up is happening, but it's certainly one of the places where those discussions are occurring. There's a question about when the UN summit is happening. If you mean the UN Committee on Food Security, that is October 10th to 14th this calendar year. The UN Food Systems Summit was last year in 2021. And feel free to pop in a question to elaborate on which summit you were talking about. Colton was asking about, are there ways for young farmers entering the workplace aside from policy changes? In other words, how do you get into farming? And that's such a good question. I mean, for policy changes, partly you need to encourage there to be policies that allow intergenerational transfer to be more effective. So that may mean within your family, what are the costs? You know, to what extent does your family have to pay such a high rate of taxes that they have to sell land and there isn't a way to transfer to the next generation? There's also the issue of people who aren't from a farming family. How do they get in? One great portal of entry has been urban agriculture, because the cost of entering is much less and you don't need that large footprint. So these are good opportunities for you to engage in some of these issues. There's also different groups around the world that talk about some of these things. So I'm sure the International Agricultural Students Association, who's on this call, is very involved in that. There are groups like Future Farmers of America. I think you said that you were from America, who are working on these kinds of issues and are also spaces where you can engage people. And on a personal level, I'll say that, you know, it's important perhaps to see if you could get a job on a farm. There are lots of older farmers who are looking for a succession plan who may not have children interested in farming. And I know several people in my own country in Canada who've ended up finding bright young people who care about the business and have created really favorable arrangements to transfer the farm to them in smaller parcels over time to make that possible. Absolutely critical issue. We need the next generation of farmers. Great. Are there some more questions? I see one question about the links. If you're not able to copy, what you might want to do is click on the link and get that open in the back end of your computer. So when you have a chance to go online, you can save that. Great. So, and I see one last question from a guest who is Brazilian, living in France and working in Africa. Yeah, you do not have to choose between those three places to be engaged in the UN Committee on Food Security. All of those areas are involved. And if you're looking to get more involved in terms of reaching out to a country, you may wish to reach out to one or three of those. You know, you might want to start with where your passport's from, go to Brazil, see if they're willing to take you on youth engagement, go to France next, noting that you're living there, and carry on to an African country where you're working. But any of those may be opportunities. I can't guarantee they'll say yes, but I can guarantee if you're not reaching out, you won't have even the chance. So we really do encourage you to get engaged. And if you want to be involved, in the civil society mechanism or the private sector mechanism, you're totally welcome to get engaged in those processes. We're all keen to have you. So with that, we're at time, and I wanted so much to thank you all for coming and joining today. NGIN is a great opportunity to give skills across this broad range of youth organizations and to help you to coordinate and be more engaged in these processes. Your voice is so needed. And in the next workshop, there will be space for 50 of you to be part of a special session where we will do bilateral training to help get you ready for these meetings with ambassadors and UN agencies. We'll do some role playing. You'll be in workshop group breakout groups, actually taking the floor and providing some input on what you as youth want in these systems. So if you haven't already applied for one of those 50 slots, please do so. We'll put it in the chat again. And on behalf of Nelly, Xander, Mumbi, and the rest of my team, thank you so much for joining us today. I hope you learned a little bit about the UN.